I'm hugely excited to be interviewing Frank Luntz about some fascinating work that he's been doing here in the UK. But first I should really introduce Frank. He's a well-known, renowned American political commentator, pollster, pundit. He once said he moderated an average of 100 plus focus groups a year over 5 years, which makes me feel quite weak. His track record's extraordinary. He worked with Newt Gingrich on Contract with America, on Rudy Giuliani's campaigns to be mayor of New York. He advised the administration of George W. Bush. And the key to Frank's approach to political work is language. It was Frank Luntz who said, stop calling it the inheritance tax or the estate tax, call it the death tax. Don't talk about global warming, talk about climate change. Don't talk about Obama's healthcare reform, call it a government takeover. He has written numerous books. One that stands out for me is Words That Work. It's not what you say, it's what people hear. And this is really one of the key themes of what we're going to talk about this evening. Although an American who's done most of his work in the United States, Frank's no stranger to British politics. At Oxford, we were both there in the 1980s, he helped Boris Johnson become president of the Oxford Union at the beginning of an extraordinary rise up the greasy pole. He was one of the first people to see the potential of David Cameron as a candidate for the Conservative leadership back in 2005, I think. And it's been a return to the UK for Frank, who's been with us at the Centre for Policy Studies as an academic fellow, analysing British public sentiment on a whole range of issues. But one in particular stands out. On the basis of 3,000 interviews, he's put together an extraordinary report on populism and wokeism, a language dictionary of the United Kingdom. And I want to begin with wokeism, Frank, because that's a term that almost nobody used in this country, I think even a year or two ago. And it's only really beginning to grab the attention of the political class. Maybe we should begin by explaining what wokeism is and maybe also cancel culture.
Well, one of the problems is that it is truly one of the worst imports from America that the UK has ever done. You gave us the Beatles and we're giving you wokeism. So on behalf of the country, I apologize for this. Basically, wokeism is challenging the system, is saying that you succeeded not because of your effort, not because of your merit, but because of your identity. And it seeks to go back, in some cases, hundreds of years, that people did not get the right opportunities in the 1800s, 1700s, and before that. And therefore, it is illegitimate where you are in society, what you have achieved, you do not deserve, and they have the right to take it from you. And worse yet, it truly is hostile to the great British traditions, to British culture, to a history that we should be respecting. They don't, and they wish to rewrite it. And so I think it's a very dangerous situation. You're not as bad off as we are in America, but just as we get worse every single day, you're getting worse here.
And that's a really important prediction that you make, that this is going to get worse, even although at this point it's not what a majority of British people want. So explain a bit why you think the trend is not our friend, and why, as you put it recently, it's not what the people of the UK want, but it's coming anyway.
Wokeism to me is similar to the coronavirus, which is you cannot see it, you cannot feel it, but when it gets to you, when you actually get it, it can be deadly. And there's no vaccine for it. There's no way to get it out of the system, and that's why I'm so pessimistic. If you become woke, you reject everything around you. You reject other people's success. You identify them by how they look rather than what they've achieved. And I'm so pessimistic because of the combination of wokeism, social media, and politics. Politics divides country, seeks to weaponize the language of wokeism, and social media allows you to disseminate it. So it actually is, as I think about it, it actually is completely like coronavirus, in that it may have started in China, but thanks to the airlines, our social media, it became prevalent all across the globe.
So I want to look at some of the data in your research, because it seems that at first glance, as if right now wokeism hasn't got that far. I think you show that 38% of British voters actually don't know what woke means. Only 5% say we're totally woke, and 4 times that number say they're definitely not woke.
It's good news, by the way.
Right.
Because the hostility here is actually greater than it is in the US.
Yeah.
And I think the reason is the strength of the institutions themselves. And while Brexit may have shaken the public's confidence in the democratic process, certainly the protests that I watched going on month after month, in fact, year after year, was very problematic. But your system is so strong. And the only danger, true danger, is if people lose faith in the future. If they do not see that ladder to success, or they see the ladder and someone or something is blocking them. But I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you the numbers behind it. 42% of the population feels invested in the UK. Only 27% feel that the UK is invested in them. How can you have a successful economy, a successful political system? How can you fight against woke when 3 out of 4 people in this country, adults in this country, do not think the country's invested in them and in their future? That's a disaster.
I want to go back to that in a minute, because one of the things you show, which surprised me, is that that feeling is shared between Labour and Conservative supporters. But before we get to that, let me ask a question about that difference between the US and the UK. As you know, I live and work in the United States. I was talking to a Conservative MP the other night who said, you warned us about wokeism a couple of years ago. We all thought you'd gone slightly balmy. Now we get it. Now, I've certainly been spending time in the UK in the last few weeks, feeling a certain relief that the kind of atmosphere that now exists on university campuses in the US isn't here, or at least isn't here so much. And my working hypothesis has been, it's okay, this is Britain, and ultimately the great British public isn't so likely to go down this path. And one reason I thought that was that race is a less salient or neuralgic issue in the UK than it is in the US. The British are essentially much more concerned about class than race. So could that be one reason that wokeism doesn't become such a problem here? Or do you think identity politics can be used as a wedge issue here, despite the very different history and memory of race?
Identity politics can be used in any aspect of a human being. Is it your gender? Is it where you come from? Is it where you went to school? Clearly, in this country, where you went to school matters much more than it does in the States. Obviously, socioeconomic is essential, but the challenge here is the antidote. And that's what I've been searching for. I don't want to uncover a problem without also uncovering a solution. And the aspect of wokeism that most definitely needs to be addressed is the concept of mutual respect. Do you believe that your employer respects you? Do you respect your employer? Do you respect your neighbors? Do you appreciate them? Do you value them? And do they value you? In the US, we become so individualized that we seek to even care about the people around us. We do about our friends and about our family. But if you're not in either of those two groups, you become irrelevant to us. It's why people become ruder and nastier. And I also think that a contributor to that is the political ugliness, the coarseness, where we interrupt each other and we're so rude and intolerant of other points of view. I'm a focus group moderator. I do this all the time. In America, I cannot get more than 2 or 3 minutes into the group before someone issues the first challenge by saying, you can't be serious. And then it gets to, you are serious, well, you're just uninformed. And then that becomes, you're dumb. And it gets ugly and divisive and polarizing. And it's a real challenge for the US to remember how we used to be. In Britain, I've done 3 of them now. Not a single time has a voice been raised. Not a single time has anyone cut anybody off. In fact, people feel fascinated by points of view that they don't agree with. As long as you have that open-mindedness, that sense of discovery, you're going to be fine. In America, we've now written people off, and I blame the political leadership for this. They put these thoughts in the public's head that if you're wrong, you're not just stupid, you're evil.
And I think what's really interesting is how quickly that happened. And to me, one of the interesting things in your report is that you find evidence that there is a change underway. And I'll just quote a couple of things that really leapt out at me. A third of Labour supporters now believe that if you've said or done something that's obviously sexist, racist, or hurtful towards marginalised communities, you should face the consequences. Around a third of the people you surveyed are more afraid to express an unpopular opinion than they used to be. And here's a critical point that you've identified. The young, and this is also true in the United States, are much more woke than the old. Question, have you ever stopped talking to someone, whether in person or online, because of something political they said? 53%, more than half of 18 to 29-year-old Britons say yes. Only 14% of Britons over 65. So this is generational, and that's why you're right to be worried, because the future, that the younger generations are a great deal more intolerant, woke in the sense of wanting to cancel other people who disagree with them than older Britons. So it's going to get worse.
It's going to get worse. And they ask this question, because I'll use Donald Trump as an example. Does he speak the way you approve of? And the answer, even among Trump voters, is no. Does he use language? Does he treat people the way you would want your children to treat others? Does he show people respect? Does he award them dignity? And the answer is almost always no, even among his own people. Well, here's the problem. When young people start to see adults behaving badly, adults just dismissing. If you don't agree with him, you're a rhino. I get his emails every single day. It's hard to find an email where he's not condemning some Republican, criticizing them, trying to take them down, and calling them a rhino. So by definition,
they're Republican in name only.
And that's the worst thing you can be called. By definition, if you disagree with Donald Trump, you're a rhino. That's bullshit. And I'm not supposed to use that language, but there's your coarsening of the culture. If you disagree with Donald Trump, you're not a good Republican. Who gave Donald Trump the right to decide who's a good Republican? Who gave Trump the right to be so ugly about his opponents? To be so supportive of people who come to work for them? Why is it that everyone who comes to work for him turns out to be an enemy of the country? Turns out to be a rhino? Turns out to be unqualified, incapable, worthy of his ridiculous slogans about them?
But this seems like
everyone who works for him. Now, that behavior goes out on social media, goes out on broadcasts like this. And that behavior ends up getting shared across the globe. How is wokeism and cancel culture happening here? Because you watched it on American television. Because you watch people who sound like I do, not like you. You listen to people who have my accent, behave badly. And now it's coming here.
But there's an interesting difference, isn't there? It's not, although people often try to draw the parallel, as if Boris Johnson is just a British version
Absolutely
of
not.
Donald Trump. Boris is more likely to quote ancient Greek.
Boris has written more books than Donald Trump has read.
Right, and so there's a difference there.
Smile.
But here's
pause and smile.
Oh,
I know you're smiling.
no. I think we're all well aware of how little Donald Trump's read. But let me ask a question about the other side politically, because wokeism is very much something that emanated from the left. If populism was a kind of reaction to wokeism, a coarsening of the politics of the right, wokeism itself begins on the left. And what struck me as I was reading the report was that it's really much more of a problem for Labour. It's on the Labour side that 52% of Britons believe, quote, the United Kingdom is an institutionally racist and discriminatory nation, which is the classic woke position in the United States. There's something fundamentally evil about the United States. Well, now we're hearing this from Labour voters. And I find myself wondering, could this become a problem for Labour? Because it seems to me that that's not a popular position. That is not the way to build support in the middle ground of British politics. Let me pose to you the question that if Labour gets associated with wokeism, it will actually be a fundamentally self-harming strategy, because this isn't the way that you win elections in the UK.
The single most alarming statistic to me, other than the lack of investment of the country in their own people, was the 37% of Labourites who think that Britain's a failed country. Not failing, failed. And when 1/3 of your party simply rejects the country that you represent, that's impossible, that's untenable. Wokeism begets populism. The reason why Trump was elected was out of reaction to what had been happening for not just years, but for decades, a sense that you were ignored, forgotten, or even worse, betrayed. Wokeism and the idea that you're wrong and I'm right just because I say so, and I have the ability to remove you from your position of authority because I think you're behaving badly, that's not democratic. Does not promote economic freedom. That is what, arguably, that's what Stalin used to do in the 1930s. Of course, in the end, you were canceled by being killed. But this is what that Russian government led to in the 20s and 30s. It's a strong comparison, but one has to think of the consequences of it. And I've been getting so much great feedback for this work and for this commentary, with the exception of my friends who are on the far left. And I have a fair number, because I don't really care what someone's politics are. I enjoy the art of disagreement. I learn much more from my friends on the left than I do my friends on the right. That said, my friends on the left, and you heard me be critical of Trump and populism, they can handle it. My friends on the left are apoplectic about this, and they say that this in itself is triggering a culture war. And why that is so serious? And you understand this better than I do, because I'm just a pollster. You're brilliant.
I'm an academic, which means I've been much closer to the source of wokeism, which emanated from the university.
Yeah, but thank God you're an academic from a university that's going to protect you, not from a place that's going to off you.
Fingers crossed.
I have every faith that you're going to be okay.
I don't. I mean, the truth of the matter is that what's happening in the US, and this is why I think British viewers should be concerned, is an increasingly intolerant culture, not only in universities, but it spreads outwards to publishers, to the media, and then ultimately to all corporations, because this idea of identity politics as something that transcends any notion of objective truth is very potent indeed, and it can be instrumentalized by people to take down their enemies. And this is something I wanted to ask you about. It seems to me that your report is giving us an interesting, almost dialectical story. There's wokeism on the left, and then there's a kind of intolerant populism on the right, and they feed off one another. What was,
they get stronger.
In the US, Trump was in many ways a gift to the woke. It energized the left and gave them an even a more intense sense of moral superiority.
The reason why so many people voted in America was because of Donald Trump, not Joe Biden. If Joe Biden thinks he won the election, he's wrong. Donald Trump lost this election. And he lost it because so many people could not stand him.
Right. So
from the center could not stand him.
And this hostility, which is at the root of populism, towards politics, towards the political establishment, is something that you show is here in the UK. I loved one of your more profane questions. You asked people whether they agreed with this statement. When I look at the politicians...
Hold on, you got to give the warning. You got to give the parents... Take your kids, either put your hands over their ears or send them out of the room. Well, I have never asked a question like this, ever.
Well, I loved it because it was the populist question. When I look at the politicians and how they treat us, I just think, well, F them all, I'll say, as this is a family show. And 61% of the people you surveyed in Britain agree with that. Now, that's the populist sentiment. The whole system's rigged. And as you say, when 70%, I'm going to quote you here, when 70% of the population think their MPs are in it for themselves or their party, you have a problem. Now, talk a little bit about this relationship between populist disgust with established politics and the advantages that this gives wokeism, because it seems to me the two things are in some ways interacting with one another.
The genesis of all this is in the most important areas of American and British life, really global life. The areas that affect how we think: academia, the media, and entertainment. Because in the end, those are the only places where we get our point of view. Academia for the young, the media for the older, and entertainment for everybody. Right. So if you've got a bias and you put it out in your television or your movies, it seeps into the body politic and it affects people. If you put it out in your media, people tend to believe it. If it's coming from academia, that changes how people think. I saw the most amazing survey that we did not do. The kids graduating from high school in America are about the same Republican Democrat. When they graduate from college, they're more Democrat than Republican by 2.5 to 1. What happens in those 4 years?
Well, it would be surprising if it didn't really, because when you look at the ratios in the faculties of American universities of Democrats to Republican, you kind of start at 5 to 1 in economics, it's 14 or 17 to 1 in history. By the time you get to sociology, it's 44 Democrats for every one conservative professor. So universities in the US very clearly play this role.
And you would think that the most important diversity of all is not race or gender or socioeconomic status. In a university, the most important is an intellectual.
Do you see this happening in British universities?
I hope not. I'm affiliated. I taught for a week at the Blavatnik School, and it is my hope to teach more. I think it's the most amazing place because of the diversity of thought, the diversity of the student body, the incredible inclusion of the faculty, and how tight everybody is. But I think that the Blavatnik School is the exception. I hope it's not. I hope that's because I do want to stay here for longer. I do want to keep coming back.
Well, I see you as the first refugee to Britain from American wokeism, but it's interesting
There's a
that,
piece of me that is.
but if you're right, and this trend is not your friend, and ultimately Oxford's just a few years behind Yale, then this may not, in fact, be such a successful escape. It's like fleeing from Germany to France in 1938. You're buying yourself 2 years. But
You're too smart. You realize that a bunch of people did not get your historic reference,
But you see what I mean, that
touche.
if you're right, this probably isn't the last resting place. You'll have to move on if wokeism wins. But let me try to be a bit more optimistic, because it seems to me, I am about Britain, because when I read the small print, it struck me that there are some issues that really matter to British voters that are in fact natural, old school conservative issues. For example, when you look and you ask people, what are the most important things that you want government to do? What are the things that you're most afraid of in Britain today? You get, number one, our streets and neighbourhoods are getting less safe and more violent.
And why that matters is for Labour, not the Conservatives. How does Labour assert itself? And even in the States, the Democratic Party, why didn't it do better in 2020? It defeated Donald Trump, but Republicans were gaining seats in local levels. And one of the major reasons was the attitudes towards the police and the attitudes towards criminal behavior. If you don't think that crime is an issue, if you don't prioritize public safety, which is the positive side of crime. Actually, when you talk about crime, it's a negative. The very fact that there's crime means that something is failing somewhere and people are getting hurt. Public safety is the exact opposite way of communicating it, and that's what the public is seeking. Not less crime, more public safety.
And this is again where it seems to me the left gets into trouble on both sides of the Atlantic, because much of the crime wave we've seen in the United States really can be traced back to the protests that followed the murder of George Floyd. It started out as a great national wave of indignation about police brutality, but it didn't take terribly long for there to be a breakdown of order, not least because the police felt demoralized in many American cities.
And who are the defunders of the police? It's not in the African American community. It's not in the Latino community. It was in the white liberal community. The people who were yelling, defund the police, many of them were wealthy, suburban, exiles from society that had become woke themselves and saw the police as an example of authority that they didn't appreciate because they thought the authority did not respect people, and the police are not perfect. One of the challenges to woke is for those on the right to acknowledge and to mean it, that our societies are not perfect. We have examples of inequality, we have examples of people being held back, that opportunity is not made available to everyone, yet not only to acknowledge it, but to commit to addressing it and actually do it. The way that you destroy woke, the kryptonite, is to actually remove that inequality, to remove that unfairness from society, for businesses to address it. But it is not to overturn hundreds of years of a successful economy, of a successful political system. It is not to throw everybody out because you don't like how you were spoken to by your boss.
So I imagine that for the Conservative Party in this country, the crime issue is still going to be a source of traditional Conservative support. You also point out that people are worried about inflation, although you say don't call it inflation, talk about affordability and the daily cost of life. But that's an issue which historically, if we think back to the 60s and 70s, was important for Conservatives.
That's not a throwaway conclusion. The people here who are watching should know that this is intimidating, because I know who you are, I know what you've written, I know how much you know, and I feel that my part of this is so cheap and so insignificant, with the exception of the part about language. It actually determines who gets elected.
And that's where I want to go, because it seems to me that what you're saying is that the solution does lie in the language of politics.
A solution.
And, well, it's the one that you emphasise, it's the one that's central to your work. And I've been thinking as I was reading the report, what does that actually mean in practice? There are parts of the report which I think are very interesting to anybody who's in a business, running a business, because you show that there is a great deal of populist hostility to business leaders. I mean, the F them all question gets about 50% agreement on business. The words that people use for business leaders in this country are they're disappointed, they feel ignored by them, they feel irrelevant in the eyes of business leaders. So this is a story, and I want to emphasize this, not just about politics, it's also about business and the way people in Britain think about the economy. But your argument is we need to use our language or change our language, because there are certain words that just turn British voters off. The word corporation itself. So a couple of examples which struck me. You say that if you're an employer, you should call yourself an employer and say, we'll be guided by the principle of fairness, not we will foster diversity and inclusion. You should talk about your employees and what talk a bit about this, because this is interesting to me.
An employer means you're a job creator. A corporation means you have shareholders. I mean, that's how the public sees it. Shareholders is about Wall Street, about the FTSE 100. Employer is about jobs. It's one of the reasons the most important change that needs to happen on both sides of the Atlantic is the word capitalism.
And it's a word we should drop.
It's a disaster now, because capitalism does represent the CEO, not the workforce. It represents the City of London rather than the surrounding communities. It represents that which is big rather than the mom and pops, the high street stores, the restaurants, and all the small business owners that really determine the success or failure of our economy. If you call yourself a capitalist, you put a red X over you, you put a target over you, and people are going to shoot at you. And we got two choices. One of them in the States, it's economic freedom. Because economic freedom is that small business owner. Economic freedom is the employee who may someday own a business, or at least appreciates the benefits that the economy gives them. And the other one for this country is an open economy, which does amazingly well because people consider open to give them a chance. And I go back to a statement from the very beginning of this broadcast. Do you see a path to a better future? Is someone or something blocking you? If the answer is yes, you see a path and no one is blocking you, you will not fall prey to woke or cancel culture or white privilege. But if something is in your way and you can't find that way, then you are going to be disgruntled, and you actually have a right to be. So I want to be clear about this, and my point of view has changed, having conversations like this at least 10 times a day. That's been the most wonderful thing about the Center for Policy Studies, is that the people come through these doors are the leaders of this country, not just the political leaders, but the economic leaders, the cultural leaders, the social leaders. Everyone from, I don't know if I'm supposed to acknowledge it, so I won't give you the specific name, but I've met with some of the religious leaders. I met the cultural leaders here to have a discussion about this because they want to understand their people, their constituents, the people that they serve, which in itself is a conclusion. Show humility, show respect. You don't hold office, you serve your constituents. if they will demonstrate that sense of humility, where I'm here for you, I'm grateful you put me here and I'm here for you, so much of the problem will dissipate. But if they think that they're ignored, forgotten, or God forbid betrayed, they will come after you.
One word that doesn't really feature much in the report is socialism, and the Institute of Economic Affairs just recently published a report showing alarming levels of support for socialism amongst young Britons. And so I wanted to ask you about the relationship between wokeism and socialism, and whether you see evidence that socialism could make a comeback as part of the revulsion against capitalism that you're talking about.
In the States, young people think more favorably of socialism, and young Democrats think more favorably of socialism than they do of capitalism. And it's not that they know anything about socialism, or that they can define it, or they can point to countries and say this is socialism. It's that they've come to reject capitalism. They've rejected their own system because to them it's unfair, it's unjust, it's unequal, it's all those things that by necessity has to be addressed. And I think that that is where we should be focused. These are the solutions so we get to keep the economy, we get to keep the political system, which is that every year we need to readjust. We need to prove to people we're listening to them and we care. I have a number of friends who give me a hard time when they think that I'm simply glossing over the problems. And so it's why I'll stop a conversation like this, even knowing that the people who are listening right now don't share this point of view, to say you ought to hear them. I respect what they think, I respect how they feel. If you think the system is unjust, then I need to hear that, and I need to try to address it. It may not be so, and that's the issue of woke. Woke says, if you're unjust, you're unjust. If you're a racist, you're a racist. And woke actually seeks to destroy, not to build. Woke seeks to eliminate, not to expand. The most important word in all of social justice is the word inclusion. So you all can't see this, but we've got a couple of people, got 3 people behind the cameras. Inclusion is all 5 of us. Diversity is 1 from this table and 1 from back there. We want inclusion. Woke doesn't respect inclusion. Woke wants to shut people out.
So let me come back to a point you made earlier that I think is really important, and that's pessimism. One of the things that really startled me was the pessimism that you discovered. Less than half of the people you surveyed, 44%, think the next generation will have a better quality of life than they do. So it's actually more than half who expect the next generation to have a worse quality of life. Do you think that pessimism is part of what's driving both wokeism and populism? And do you think restoring optimism about the future is a part of the key to defeating these 2 toxic political movements?
You can't tell someone who's depressed, snap out of it. It doesn't work. You can't tell people that happy days are here again when it's in the middle of a depression. So in the way that you frame that question, we can't say to people, be optimistic, because they know how they're living their day-to-day lives. They have a certain perspective. What you can do is give them reasons to be optimistic. You can give them proof. You can give them facts behind it. And I actually think the core of all of this, far more important than language, is where you come from, is a university. Far more important than anything we say is what we teach our children. And if this is the one message that I would give, if you said, you get 30 seconds to look straight in the camera and tell the opinion elite out there, if you let your schools fail, you are failing your society, you're failing your culture, you're failing your country, and you're failing your future. The fact that we've got kids who are graduating and they cannot read at graduation levels, that they cannot add and subtract properly, that they have trouble operating even a cash machine, that we have young people who are graduating that can't possibly hold the jobs of the future, and we're still giving them diplomas. That's telling them that they're ready to go out into the world, and they can't. Guess what happens? They fail, and then they blame society for allowing them to fail, and it makes them angry. It makes them do antisocial behavior, and that's bad for all of us. I do more work on student reform, learning reform, building new high schools, and being involved in changing how we impart information and learning to students, they're not asking for equity. They're asking to know problem solving, critical thinking. They're asking to be able to function as adults.
Well, employable adults.
And the system is failing them,
How
and
much-
you should be outraged about this.
How much do you think this failure is bound up with wokeism, in the sense that more and more we read here in the United Kingdom, as in the United States, of excesses in the educational system? The decolonisation of the curriculum turns out to mean you no longer teach Shakespeare or for that matter, Chaucer. To Kill a Mockingbird is no longer something that can be studied at school. Are you concerned that fashions like critical race theory are being imported into the UK from the US, so that we have not just the problem that schools don't get people to be literate and numerate, but that they actually start to indoctrinate them with woke ideology?
I think the best thing that happened to the UK was when the borders were shut to Americans. There, I finally got a smile out of you. Actually, just keep us out for 5 years until we get over this. No, send me back too. I may not go back. And when the door shuts, you've all seen that sci-fi film, when they're all running for the door shuts and the people who don't make it out. There's a piece of me that does not know where to go now. This is being filmed. I know it's going out live, but we're doing this on the 7th of July, I believe, which is a very important day here in the UK for those who are lost because of terrorism. On the 7th of July, I don't know what I'm going to do when my time is up in just over 2 weeks. I don't know if I want to go back. I don't know if I want to stay. I'm still an American. I still love my country, but we're not a shining city on a hill. If you still believe that, then just attend any of these focus groups. Listen to the things I see. Look at the polling that I see. Look at the research that I do, and listening to the country. On an individual level, we are good people. But as a country, it's hard to be proud of the things we say, hard to be proud of the things that we do. I want to be. I always hated it when Michael Moore would come to London and trash America.
There you're doing.
And here I am doing it. And I know it, and I recognize it, and I apologize. I apologize for it, because I should not be doing it. But I don't know what to do to speak up and speak out. The crap that I get on my email, the conspiracy theories and the stuff that people are sending around to each other on social media, it's a lie. It is not true. Donald Trump lost the election. George Bush did not put bombs into the World Trade Center towers to bring them down. These conspiracy theories drive me crazy because millions of Americans believe it.
Is it less apparent here? I mean, I get the sense that the conspiracy theory spreads through the internet without regard for national borders, but there is somewhat less susceptibility in the UK.
You don't get it. Look at the difference between you and I right now as we sit here, which is you're calm and collected and asking me very smart questions.
Remember, I'm an American too, but I went in the opposite direction.
Yes.
I left the UK in search of opportunities, so perhaps I'm instinctively a little bit more optimistic about the US's capacity to reinvent itself. But I want to get to some questions.
Or the cocktails have not worn off yet.
Well, it may be that the immigrants just always are more optimistic than the native born.
Because they made the choice to be there.
So we have an interesting challenge here, and I want to get to some of the questions that are coming for the audience in the remaining time. But before we do
please
that,
ask questions. I see that we got 5 of them here. Come on,
go
ask
to
questions.
Just a second. My last question really has to do with language. I mean, your bottom line is we need to change the language of politics, and by implication, you're more interested in how conservatives talk. But you're also really addressing this to the Labour Party too. And I just want to point out, because to me this was fascinating, the words that you think work. You say, here are the 5 words that resonate with Britons: healthy, responsible, a plan, honesty, accountability. Here's your takeaway. Fairness and equality are essential British values. Wokeism is dependent on a belief that Britain's failing in each area. As long as business leaders are seen to be upholding these principles, wokeism won't take hold. So you do have an answer. I mean, you have a solution, but it's really a solution, as often in your work, that has to do with changing the terms we use. And I wonder if that's going to be enough.
But it's not enough. It is not enough, but it has to be an authentic commitment to the things that are being offered here. For example, it cannot just be a detailed plan of action. You actually have to do it. You cannot talk about accountability. There has to be no exceptions and no excuses. No exceptions. Everyone's got to do it, no excuses. If you didn't do it, you should be fired. Honesty. People have the right to know what you really think, and you have the responsibility to tell them what you really think. In each of these, the words mean something. There are better words to use, but the words represent the principles, they represent the values of what the public has every right to expect. And the fact, if you go to the NHS here, which is so respected in the UK, and the US laughs at the British for having the system, it's one of the great differences between our countries. You expect to be treated at the NHS, and you don't expect, and it irritates you that you have to wait so long for an operation, that you have to wait so long for the coverage that you can get immediately in the States. But it's all paid for with your tax dollars. It's the #1 institution in the country in terms of respect, and it's the #1 institution in terms of what people want reformed. So it depends on how you analyze the data. Is it a success? Yes. Is it a failure? Yes. And that is not contradictory.
But freedom comes well below these magic words. It comes below trust and integrity. It comes well below equality. It comes below security and stability. And I suppose that made me a bit nervous. Part of what drew me to the United States was a sense that freedom ranked a bit higher, perhaps above equality. But let's go to some questions from the audience in the remaining time. And let's try and get through as many as we can if you fancy a lightning round. The first question has to do with independent candidates and third parties in the US. Do you see any chance of the emergence of a third party, or are we going to be stuck with Democrats and Republicans for the rest of our lives?
The only way that a third party will be effective is if that person is well funded. Because in the end, third party candidates almost 99% of the time they lose. We've got 2 independents in the Senate, but most of them are clearly identified with a specific political party. Mike Bloomberg could have been an effective presidential candidate as an independent. He was not going to be effective as a Democrat.
Should he have run in 2016?
He should have run in 2020 as he did, but he should not have run as a Democrat. Yep. Democrats are not going to vote for rich people.
So here's a good question about the more personal side. How can liberally minded people work against wokeism in their everyday life?
By being willing to say to someone, do you really mean that? And I do this, and I realize I have to apologize because I'll interrupt. I've done it a couple times with you, and I need to stop doing it. But I'll ask a question, and I don't want to wait until you change the topic. I want to focus on that word or that phrase. Is there a better way to say it? Is there a better way to address it? I am constantly challenged, and I encourage people to do it. I was going to put out a global email telling people that I'm here in Britain. I want to do on the 4th of July. My own office says to me, don't do it. That's the day that people are celebrating. They don't want to hear from you. Leave them alone. Monday's a holiday. Wait until Tuesday to do it. And I did. I waited. And that was the right decision. You've got to be open-minded enough to realize that every thought you have isn't correct.
Here's a question to which I have absolutely no idea of the answer. What do you attribute the 20-point advantage in public perception that female Tory MPs enjoy in comparison to female Labour MPs?
They're not. That was a misprint. Good, I'm glad you caught it. Here's my acknowledgement that of the 286 pages, there was one thing wrong. It is actually a female conservative versus a male Labourite. What we found was, conservatives have a 4-point advantage over Labour in understanding women, which is not a success because conservatives were preferred by 10 points in 2019. But the moment you add a female conservative to a male Labourite, then the conservatives, their lead jumps to 22 points. Yes.
Centre for Policy Studies viewers and readers have eagle eyes, and I'm glad I asked that question because it was slightly baffling me. Do you believe, one of our viewers asks, that your polling or research is free from your own political bias?
No. And that's why I present it. So, and I will not acknowledge who I've shown it to, but labor leaders have been examining the data, examining the analysis, going through all of this, and challenging me. So that as I do the analysis, as I created the questionnaire and I'm doing the analysis, I have people checking on that to ensure that I'm doing it correctly. This is really important to me. I invite my students wherever I teach to challenge me at any time, in any way, in any fashion, public or privately. You can take me on. Be able to back it up. But I always want to be challenged. None of us are free of political bias. It's just that in my case, all the time, 24/7, people can say, wait a minute, are you sure that's correct?
Another question about our political system. Do you believe that lobbyists are partly responsible for the distrust of politicians in the system?
Absolutely, because you combine lobbyists and money in politics and you created a problem. No one is more expert in this than Larry Lessig at Harvard. And he's done such an incredible study of the corruption in politics that lobbying and special interest groups, pressure groups is what you call them here. It's a problem. And there's so much money now. And the problem is it's no longer lobbying for stuff. It's now lobbying against. And so you're creating an ugliness and a meanness and a negativity to a system that is already susceptible to it. So yeah, they're a problem, but I still think the political leadership is worse. I think when people dismiss people, there's a Democratic leader who said that anyone who's enabling Trump should be challenged, challenge them in the supermarket, challenge them at the movie theater, challenge them at the gas station. No, leave people alone. You take your politics into the private sphere of someone's private life and people are gonna get hurt. In the UK, you had an MP who was gunned down. We've had the same situation in the US. Enough. You should not be afraid for your life to serve your country as a member of Congress or an MP.
We're almost out of time, so I think we just have time for a couple more questions. What aspects of populism and wokeism do you see in previous political doctrines that took hold? I'm interested in this question as a historian because often in the last few years we heard Trump likened to a fascist, to Mussolini. My sense was that Trump's populism was something different, which had its roots in an American tradition going back all the way to the 19th century. How do you think about this? I mean, wokeism too seems to me to have antecedents, maybe going all the way back to the more extreme religious sects of the Puritan era. Where did this all come from? Because it's not as if it's completely new.
It's not completely new, and I actually would relate Trump to Huey Long in the 1930s. And his was a left of center populism about the public's rights. Everyone had a right to a job, a right to a car, a right to a house. The truth is that was also from Herbert Hoover, most certainly not a populist in 1928. So we are stealing from each side. We're stealing little bits and pieces from different parts of history. I'm convinced that Trump did not steal anything. I'm convinced he did not know what Huey Long said. He did not know what Herbert Hoover said. And I'm also convinced that there are elements that are not only justified, but should be commended. When Hillary Clinton called them a basket of deplorables, that in itself was deplorable. Who is she to insult tens of millions of people who truly did feel ignored and forgotten and were ignored and forgotten? Nobody cares about the citizens of Kentucky or Tennessee or West Virginia. These people are left behind. They are ignored. There are so many programs to help my students in Watts and in Compton. I work at a school called Verbum Day. Best kids in America. They come from the most difficult surroundings. They don't know it, or if they do, they don't let it hold them back. Absolutely committed to success. They get into a dozen colleges. They're amazing kids, but they are surrounded by really difficult circumstances. They don't know they're victims, and so they don't act like victims. They're empowered, and so they act like people who have agency. That's success. Trump's people don't have the support. They don't have the government benefits, and they don't want it either. They don't want a check from the government. They want to do it themselves. I respect To be clear, I do not respect Donald Trump. I respect the Trump voter explicitly, specifically, in every possible way. And I know that this video will be circulated, and I know that I'm going to get condemned. I want to be clear to those people who voted for Donald Trump. I get why you did. I applaud you for casting that vote. I just think the guy you voted for isn't what you think he is, and he doesn't behave in a way that you want your own children to behave.
Well, there clearly are a great many questions coming in. I could ask more, but time is up. I was thinking as you were talking there that there were deplorables in Britain too, that there were close similarities in the political events of 2016 across the Atlantic in many ways. Brexit was a kind of anticipation of Trump. And many of the people who voted for Brexit voted for the same reasons that Americans voted for Donald Trump. And I respect the reasons like you on both sides. Do you think now, 5 years on, that those people who feel excluded and who feel that the country's not investing in them, in small town Britain, are being given any more hope than their counterparts in the United States? Is the current government in the UK addressing their concerns somewhat better than its counterpart in the US?
I'm not convinced about leveling up as a slogan. I am convinced in leveling up as a policy. And it's not about North versus South. It's not about the poor versus the rich. The idea that everyone, everywhere, in all corners of this country should enjoy the same opportunities and the same chance for success as everyone else. I think that's a very legitimate philosophy, and you have a government that's committed to making that happen. That's a good thing, not a bad thing.
Frank Luntz, thanks so much. This has been a broadcast of the Centre for Policy Studies, and I think it's been a truly riveting discussion. If you have a chance, take a look at Frank Luntz's research. It'll teach you a great deal, certainly taught me a great deal about the way Britons think about politics and the economy in 2021.